Aloha and welcome to the Grassroot Institute, everyone. Great to see you this evening. It's always wonderful to gather here at the Pacific Club and to talk about ideas that really matter. Ideas matter, they have consequences, and that's why it's important to commit ourselves to learning how to win with those ideas. Part of that will be taking a look at what experts have to say from across the world. The Grassroot Institute is not a partisan organization. We, by design, receive no funds from the government, the military, political parties, or take any clients whatsoever. Instead, we base our research on best practices. And one of our scholars who has studied best practices with regard to the cost of living and land use is Randal O'Toole. I don't have to tell you, if you live in Hawaii, how difficult it is to live here because of the cost of living. And one of the major factors is the cost of housing. Last year, we had more than 12,000 residents. These are regular residents of the state of Hawaii leave. We've become a state in which we have the highest per capita rate of residents leaving the islands. And this includes two categories. You may not be surprised that young people leave for education and for opportunities and to wait until they can afford a mortgage. But you might be surprised to learn that retirees are leaving in record numbers in the state of Hawaii because they can't afford it here. So what's happening? We're a state of people who are working hard, 2 to 3 jobs, who aren't able to really afford to live here or afford a home. We have one of the highest rates of non-home ownership for any American city, which is a terrible thing. Now, one of the reasons, of course, is something that we consider to be contrived. Randal O'Toole, who's one of our scholars, follows in a series of presentations we've made, one with David Callies. David Callies is a professor at the University of Hawaii in the law school. He's one of the nation's leading experts in land use management and regulations. He shared with us recently here that Hawaii has more regulations in terms of land use than any state in the entire nation. And it's resulted in an unintended consequence. It's unintended by some, but intended by others. And that is, there's an artificial scarcity of land. Now, if you talk about that, people say, of course land is scarce in Hawaii, until you fly over it and take a look at all of the vast areas that are open. David Callies has researched this, and he's found out we actually develop on less than 95% of all the land mass. Excuse me, on less than 5%. We develop on less than 5% of all the land mass in the state of Hawaii. Can you believe that? 95% is devoted to preservation land, which is important, and agriculture. But most of the agriculturally zoned land is not even being used for agriculture. It's lying fallow. There's all this land. So I asked Professor Callies, if we only develop on 5% of the land and have an artificial scarcity as a result of this, what would happen if we increase the amount we develop on, just houses? I'm not saying fill the whole island with houses, but what if we increase by 1%? What would happen? Well, he said you'd increase the supply for land by 20%. And what happens when supply goes up to the price point? The price comes down. Suppose we increase by 2%. I said, Professor Callies, how much could we increase by without damaging the aquifer and the environment and the beauty of the land? And he said his studies show that it could increase by 7 to 10% more. That would be a phenomenal increase in the supply of land. And the only thing we have to do is figure out a constitutional way to ensure that local residents can buy that land and use it for housing that's truly affordable. Well, lo and behold, while we were doing that research here in Hawaii with Professor Callies, our own Grassroot Scholar Randal O'Toole was doing the same kind of research and going around the entire nation proclaiming an important message. And that is that the gospel that the only way to solve the housing crisis is to build up may need to be modified. So he wants to talk about the importance of building out for various reasons. Now, I want to explain something. We're not advocating today one mode of development. We're just saying there are appropriate areas where we can build up density and appropriate areas where we can build out. And nobody knows more about this than Randal O'Toole. I asked him to come here not only to talk about that, but to stick in a few things of interest to you about the rail system. Randal has done a couple things. He's the author of a couple of books, and they're available if you want to get a copy afterward. Romance of the Rails is a story of rail projects all over the world. In fact, there's a chapter on the Hawaii project, the Honolulu Area Rapid Transit. This book will go fast, I think. He's better known for American Nightmare, How Government Undermines the Dream of Home Ownership. He's an expert on land use regulation and transportation. He's the founder of the American Dream Coalition. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. But in that capacity, he is also told he can't write on certain things, and he's found a welcome home as a fellow or a Grassroot Institute scholar here in Hawaii. Would you please welcome, before you welcome him, let me tell you, would you please take note of a bicycle that's stashed away behind the information desk over here. I don't know if you can see it, but when you leave, take a look at it. When Randal arrived at the airport out of his commitment to the environment, he got his suitcase, which contained a bicycle, and he unfolded it and drove to his hotel. He drove 5 miles this morning to this presentation on that bicycle, and I'll let him tell you how many miles he's logged in Hawaii on his bicycle. He's even been hit by a truck, but you know, nothing can stop my friend Randal O'Toole. Please welcome Randal O'Toole, Grassroot Scholar. Knock him dead, Randal.
All right, well, be careful using that term. I did speak in Maui for the Grassroot Institute recently, and I believe I bicycled 388 or 488 miles, and on the 488th mile, it was going to be 500, I got hit by a truck. Didn't break any bones, but it took a few weeks to recover, and now I bicycled 95 miles so far since I got here this trip. Now I want to talk to you about housing, but I want to start out, I noticed about 2 weeks ago that the good people at Oxford University had added a new word to their English dictionary, and that word is hamajang, which is, they explain, is a Hawaiian pidgin word for all messed up. And I thought that was pretty appropriate because I want to talk about housing and land use policies that are all messed up, and I want to talk about transportation policies that are hamajang as well. Now, first I want to introduce you to the biggest city in America you've never heard of. It's called Buckeye, Arizona. Anybody here ever heard of Buckeye? Any one person? 2 people. Wow. 2 people have heard of Buckeye. Buckeye is, in land area, is the 15th largest city in the United States. But if you take away city-county conglomerations like Oahu and Honolulu, it's the 5th largest city in the United States in land area. But you've never heard of it. Almost nobody's ever heard of it. There are home builders there who are furiously building homes, and I looked up this morning, you could buy this house at $104 a square foot. That was including the land and the hookups and everything, not just the construction. That probably doesn't come with granite countertops and tile showers and things like that. So the median home, according to Zillow in January, was $122 a square foot. That's the median price of housing in Buckeye, Arizona. Now just for comparison, in Honolulu it was $547 a square foot. On Maui it was $548 a square foot. Kauai is a little bit less, $456 a square foot, and by comparison, the Big Island is almost affordable at $282 a square foot, still well over twice as expensive as Buckeye. Now, I think this is kind of like the frog in the boiling water syndrome. This has grown upon us so slowly, we've gotten used to it. And we make excuses for it. We say things like, well, it's because of the cost of shipping. We're so far away from the mainland. But oceanic shipping is actually cheaper than land-based shipping. So construction materials here shouldn't cost any more than they do in Chicago or places like that. Now, you do have the Jones Act, which is making shipping less affordable than it should be. But basically, there's no intrinsic reason why building materials should cost more here than they do on the mainland. Well then, as Kali'i said, you've got people saying, well, we're running out of land. There's just not enough land because we're an island, right? But actually, as he mentioned, there's plenty of land. He mentioned statewide, he quoted David Cowley saying 6% of the state has been developed, or 5% of the state has been developed. The latest data say it's 6, but that's not much of a difference. Oahu has the most, about 36% of Oahu is developed, but notice that less than 6% of Maui has been developed, and yet it's just as expensive. Housing there is just as expensive as in Oahu. And about 7% of Kauai has been developed, and housing there is almost as expensive as well. So it's not the amount of development that's making housing expensive. It's not the lack of land. If we look around the country, you hear people talk about the housing crisis. You read about it in the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle and other papers, and you get the idea that everywhere is expensive, but that's not true. Some places are still very affordable. Houston and Dallas and Atlanta, housing prices there, median home prices, are about 3 times median family incomes. Now, if you do the math, if you buy a house that's 3 times your income and you get a standard mortgage, you can pay off the mortgage in about 15 years. If you get a house that's 4 times your income, it's going to take 30 years. And if you get a house that's 5 times your income, under the standard formula where you can't spend more than about 30% of your income on housing, you can't pay it off. So 5 times income is unaffordable. And so we see Los Angeles and San Francisco are both slightly more unaffordable than Honolulu. And it's curious because California is a big state. There's a lot of land there. It's not an island like Honolulu is, and yet they're actually less affordable. It wasn't always this way. A few decades ago, everywhere in the country was pretty affordable. In fact, the only place that wasn't very affordable in 1969 was Honolulu. At that time, housing prices in Honolulu were about 3 times median family incomes. Now notice that's where Houston and Atlanta are today, and we consider them affordable. And then everywhere else, San Francisco, 2 times median family incomes, Atlanta, 1.8 times median family incomes, very affordable throughout the United States. So what's happened in between 1969 and today? Well, what happened was basically in Hawaii in the 1950s was pretty much a feudal society. Almost all the land, as I'm sure you know, was owned by 5 corporations, the Bishop estate. A few landowners owned almost all the land. And the Democrats won power in the legislature on a promise of land reform. They said they would take away the land from these few landowners and make it available for people to use for housing. Instead of doing that, they created what I call the new feudalism. Instead of having a few private landowners control the whole state, they decided the government should control the whole state. They passed a land use law in 1961 that put all the land in the state under government control and let the government decide whether you could build on your land or not. And basically, 94% of the land was ruled off limits for development. Just as one example, about that time, Henry Kaiser was talking about building Hawaii Kai. And he got land from the Bishop estate and built a lot of Hawaii Kai. And I'm sure you know that story, but you probably don't know is that he wanted to build much more. He actually only built about 3/4 of what he expected to build in Hawaii Kai. He got that much built, and the people who bought the houses from him then turned around and stabbed him in the back and said, we're going to use the Hawaii land use law to take away your right to use the rest of the land so we can have it as open space. I thought that was kind of ungrateful of them. I'm sure he did too, but I know he made lots of money on the land that he did sell, but the point is that just made housing more expensive. Now, Kali'i quoted David Cowley saying that Hawaii is the most regulated state in the country. The numbers say that California is actually a little more regulated. 95% of the people in California are confined to 5.5% of the land in the state. Essentially you can't build outside of an urban area in the state. And so as houses deteriorate and fall apart in the rural areas, people move to the cities and they can't move back. Hawaii is almost that bad. 91% of the people in Hawaii live on 6% of the land in the state. And it's just as restrictive in the 94% of Hawaii as it is in the 94.5% of California. Now, it isn't just the land use shortage that's making housing unaffordable, but once you create the shortage, a lot of other things happen to follow. And I'm going to show you an example that compares Dallas with San Jose. San Jose has very restrictive land use laws. Dallas has very loose land use laws. And in fact, in Texas, counties aren't even allowed to zone. There's no zoning outside of the city limits in Texas. And so Dallas knows that if they apply a lot of restrictions, that developers will just build out in the county outside the city. So Dallas and the other incorporated cities, Fort Worth and so on, don't apply a lot of restrictions. So in 2002, somebody sat down and compared what's the difference in housing prices and why are they different between San Jose and Dallas. And you can pretty much substitute Honolulu for San Jose and then Dallas or Atlanta or Houston or something for Dallas to make a similar comparison today. But basically, the land price was a big difference. The lot price in Dallas for a big lot was a lot lower than a small lot in Houston. But it wasn't just the land price, it was also permit fees, which were much higher in San Jose than they were in Dallas. And there was also the time it takes to get a permit. In Texas, you can buy land, get all your permits, build on it, and move in within 4 months of when you bought the land. And in California, it can take 6 years, and I imagine it can take quite a long time here as well. And time is money. That costs money. Plus, there's never an assurance you're actually going to get a permit, so you can invest in a lot of money and then might not get the permit. So if you're a builder, you have to roll that cost into the next house you build. And finally, there's labor costs. Because housing costs more, labor costs more, and so that adds to the cost of the house. So all these things follow from the housing shortage. You wouldn't have you wouldn't have cities standing in your way if they didn't have the growth restrictions that prevented people from building in the rural areas. Now, David Callies wrote a book in 1971 called The Quiet Revolution. He was a 28-year-old recent graduate of law school, and I think he was applauding the quiet revolution in land use laws, which was pioneered in the United States by Hawaii and followed by Vermont and Oregon and several other states. But more recently, he's written a book called Preserving Paradise, Why Regulation is Not the Solution, and saying that that's not really the way to go. If you look around the country, you look at these kind of rules, which planners call growth management, and I call the new feudalism. You see there's a strong correlation between places that have growth management, and those are the red areas. And by the way, the yellow areas are the old feudalism. About 90% of Nevada and 90% of Alaska are federally owned, and so there isn't much land for people to build on, private land. So that's kind of an old feudalism thing. But the rest of the red states and the red urban areas are new feudalism. And you look at where housing is unaffordable, it's almost a one-to-one match between feudalistic states, whether new or old, and housing affordability problems. Now, when the legislature passed the land use law in 1961, they said they were doing it to preserve the farm industry, the agricultural industry. Now, Hawaii has 1.25 million acres of agricultural land, and they've never used more than 1/3 of it for growing crops. The rest of it's been for pasture and range and stuff like that. But for growing sugarcane or pineapple or whatever, they've never used more than 1/3 of it. And what happened was they made housing, so the land use laws made housing so expensive that farmers couldn't afford to hire workers and pay them enough for them to find housing and still be able to compete against similar tropical farms in Fiji and Costa Rica and places like that. So the farm industry, just from 1982, went from 300,000 acres to 80,000 acres of croplands. So essentially, they had to destroy the agricultural industry to save it, is what the legislators would say. Well, now that we've destroyed the agricultural industry, and if anything is hamajang, I can't think of anything more than that. Now that they've destroyed the agricultural industry, they say we need to have keep people confined to these dense cities in order to relieve traffic congestion. Well, that doesn't work. But the argument is if we're dense enough, we'll ride transit more and we'll bicycle more and things like that. By the way, if you want people to bicycle more, will you fill the potholes for me, please? Wouldn't hurt if you coordinated the traffic signals a little better either. But anyway, a professor at University of California, Irvine, was hired by the Transportation Research Board to look at, which is a federal entity, to look at whether increasing densities and building high-density developments would reduce driving and relieve congestion and reduce pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And he said, well, there's a measurable difference, but it's too small to be useful if your goal is to save the planet or to relieve congestion. And Honolulu is a perfect example of that. Honolulu's density is more than twice as great as the average density of urban areas on the mainland. I believe it's the 5th densest urban area in the United States. And your bus system actually works pretty well. It carries a greater percentage of travel than any other urban area in the country except for New York. And that's pretty good, because you're at something like the 51st largest urban area, and you beat the 49 of them behind you, or ahead of you, except for New York. But still, carrying more than anybody else except New York doesn't amount to much. Only 4% of travel in Honolulu is by bus. 4%. So if it was 2% instead of 4%, would anybody notice that many more cars on the road? Not really. It's not really making that much of a difference for congestion. And by the way, in case you haven't noticed, the buses burn fuel too, and that produces just as much greenhouse gas emissions, or just about as much greenhouse gas emissions as driving a car. And then lately, the urban planners have been saying, well, millennials want to live in cities. They want to live in density. They don't want to live in low-density suburbs. Well, it turns out millennials were getting out of college right at the time of the 2008 financial crisis, and they couldn't get jobs, and so they lived in small apartments in cities because they couldn't afford anything else. But now they're getting jobs. Survey after survey is showing that they're moving to the suburbs. They want to move to the suburbs, and in fact, more of them are moving to the suburbs than are moving to the cities today. The fastest growing part of America, as usual, is the suburbs. One study found, a Gallup poll found, that 40% of the people who live in cities wish they could live in low-density suburbs or some other low-density area, whereas people who live in low-density areas, if they want to live somewhere else, they only want to live in a place that's even lower density than they already live in. So there isn't that much demand for density. Okay, so now urban planners have come up with the latest argument for density, and that is because it's supposed to be more affordable. If we build all this high-density stuff, then we'll have more affordable housing for people. Well, let's test that theory. Here's Honolulu. Density is 5,500 people per square mile. The median home is about 8.2 times the median family income. Well, what if we go to a much denser city like San Francisco? And anytime you read an article about housing affordability in San Francisco, they always show this picture of these nice little Victorian row houses, or not row houses, Victorian single-family homes. What they don't show you is that somebody built a giant apartment building right next to them, because it's real easy to build density in San Francisco. So San Francisco's 17,000 people per square mile. It's 3 times denser than Honolulu. So if the urban planners are right, it should be more affordable, right? No, it's less. It's 8.3 value to income ratio. New York City, 27,000 people per square mile. That's 5 times denser than Honolulu. So it should be more affordable, right? No, it's 8.7, as opposed to Honolulu's value to income ratio of 8.2. What about Manhattan? Then you're getting really, really dense. More than 12 times denser than Honolulu. Is it more affordable? No, this value to income ratio is 10.1. It's significantly less affordable than Honolulu. How about Hong Kong? Well, we got, what, 70,000 people per square mile, and value to income ratio is almost 20. In fact, if you compare value to income ratios with density across the United States, just forget about Hong Kong or Tokyo, just look at the American urban areas, there's a strong correlation between, a negative correlation between affordability and density. The denser you are, the less affordable you are. Now, why is that? Well, there's two reasons. First, in a dense area, especially one where you've artificially restricted the land available for development, as has been done in San Francisco and Portland and Seattle and Honolulu, land is expensive. The average price of land in Honolulu is $3.3 million an acre. Some places it's well over $6 million an acre, but the average is $3.3 million an acre. By comparison, in Dallas and Houston and Atlanta, it's about $250,000 an acre. So it's about 13 times more expensive here. So if you want to build dense housing here, you have to, if they're going to build, say, on quarter-acre lots in Atlanta or Houston, you have to build more than 50 units per acre to get the cost per unit, the land cost per unit, down to be as low as building on quarter-acre lots in Dallas or Houston or Atlanta. But if you want to build 50 units per acre, then you've got another problem, and that is construction costs are a lot higher. If you build 3 stories tall, you've got right there 30 to 50% higher cost than if you're building 1 and 2 story homes. If you're building 5-story homes, you're getting up to 4 times the cost of 1 and 2 story homes. If you're building 50 units per acre, then you're into high-rise housing, and that's going to be 5.5 to 7 times the cost per square foot of single-family homes. So density is not affordable. We can't afford density. And if you want to make housing more affordable, the last thing you want to do is build dense housing. You want to build low-density housing. Now, urban planners have tied housing into transportation because they argue that we have to build dense housing along rail lines so that we can get people to ride the train. So that means if you want dense housing, you have to build rail lines in order to convince people to build the dense housing so that they can all ride the train. And so they build what they call, or they plan what they call transit-oriented developments, which are high-density developments along the rail line. And Honolulu is writing a plan for transit-oriented developments within a quarter to a half mile of every single rail station that they're planning. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the train, because I love trains. I have loved trains all my life, but I don't think other people should have to subsidize my hobby. And basically, that's what passenger trains are today, is they're a hobby. They are not useful transportation. Freight trains are still valuable, at least on the mainland, but passenger trains are not useful transportation. Why is that? Well, there's a new invention, a new technology that superseded passenger trains. It came out 92 years ago. It's called the bus. This bus, which was introduced in 1927, was the first bus built that not only cost less to buy than a streetcar or a subway train or whatever, cost less to start up, it cost less to operate. It was faster, it was more nimble, and you could move more people per hour. It provided true high-capacity transit. And I use that term because Hart loves to call its train a high-capacity transit system. Now, urban planners say that that term is a strategic misrepresentation. Economists have a more technical term for it. They call it a lie. Let me just show you this little video. This is a bus lane between New Jersey and New York City. And this lane moves 400 buses an hour. The buses have 50 seats on board. You can do the math. They're moving a lot of people an hour. And they're not even close to their capacity. They think they could move 700 buses an hour if demand exists. So buses are high-capacity transit. Trains are low-capacity transit. Let me show you some more examples. This is a typical light rail line. This happens to be Denver. They can run 3-car trains. Each car can hold 150 people. That's a lot more people than a bus, right? But you can only run, for safety reasons, you can only run 1 train every 3 minutes. So that's 20 trains an hour. So light rail can move about 9,000 people an hour. Notice that slightly less than half of them get seats. Most of them have to stand. The Honolulu rail transit line is supposed to be a little better than light rail. You're supposed to be able to run them a little more frequently. They're going to run only 4-car trains. They claim they can fit 195 people on each car, and I think they probably could if they were in Tokyo, but I don't think Americans are going to stand that for much crowding. So I think 150 people per car is probably a more reasonable number, and at that number, they can move about 18,000 people an hour, running 1 train every 2 minutes. They're not going to do that. They're going to run 1 train every 6 minutes. But if they really needed the capacity, they could move 18,000 people an hour. Istanbul has a busway. It's about 20 miles long. They move 257 buses an hour. That's not their capacity. That's just how many they move. They move 1 bus every 28 seconds, 24 hours a day. And during peak periods, it's every 14 seconds. And the buses can hold 100 people. Some of the buses can hold 200 people, but we don't have buses like that, so just assuming 100 people a bus, they can move 30,000 people an hour. That's high capacity, much higher capacity than the HART rail line. New York City subway is the highest capacity rail line in the country because they can run 10-car trains, not just 4 little cars like the HART system. And they can run trains every 2 minutes, and they actually move faster than I think your trains are going to go. So they're moving about 45,000 people an hour. Bogota, Colombia has the most sophisticated bus rapid transit line in the world. It actually has passing lanes. You might have noticed the Istanbul didn't have passing lanes, so every single bus had to make every single stop. But this one, some buses can be express buses and they can pass other buses at the stops. And they can move 50,000 people an hour easily. They can probably move a lot more, but that's the numbers that they cite. So if you really want high capacity transit, what you should do is turn that elevated line into an express bus lanes rather than put trains on them, because the buses will go faster, they can get off and serve more neighborhoods instead of just serving that one corridor. That makes a lot more sense to me. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. Well, getting back to transit-oriented development, this is a transit-oriented development in Seattle. And the median price of a home in Seattle right now is $298 a square foot. That's because they've got a lot of land use restrictions. But this transit-oriented development is only $550 a square foot. Wowee. $530, I'm sorry. Portland was planning one. The median price of housing is $234 a square foot. They were planning one for $650 a square foot. And they called it affordable housing. And in fact, both of these were built as affordable housing. And how is it affordable? Well, they were going to sell homes for less than $300,000. It seems to me I read about a bill that's been proposed in the Hawaii legislature to build transit-oriented developments along, it's called the Aloha Bill, right? The Aloha Housing Bill. Build transit-oriented developments along the rail line and sell units for less than $300,000. Well, how are you going to sell a unit for less than $300,000 when it costs $650 a square foot? The answer is, you sell a 600 square foot 2-bedroom apartment. And that's what they were planning to do. I think it was 660 square feet, 2-bedroom apartments. Now you're getting into what I call Soviet housing. This is a housing development in the former Soviet Republic of Germany, East Germany. The average unit was 2 bedrooms, and I think it was 440 square feet. And most of these buildings have been torn down since I took this picture because as soon as they got their freedom, they all moved into single-family homes, which they weren't allowed to do before. And so that's what we're talking about, is building Soviet housing in America. I want to make sure you understand there's a difference between affordable housing and housing affordability. We use these terms almost interchangeably a lot, but they mean two extremely different things. Affordable housing is housing that's provided either by the government or by some charity at below cost to low-income people. Okay? Housing affordability is a measure of what the affordability level of housing is for all people of all incomes in the region. And the assumption is if the median home is about 3 times median family income, then the people who are rich are going to find more expensive homes, and the people who are poor are going to find less expensive homes, but everybody will be able to find a home that's affordable for them. But once you get up to around 6 or 8 or 10 family value to income ratios, then almost nobody's going to be able to find housing that's affordable to them. Now, what happens is when you start getting unaffordable housing is that politicians say, okay, we're going to solve this problem with affordable housing. Now that sounds like it makes sense, but it doesn't make any sense at all. Honolulu is talking about building 800 units of affordable housing a year. There's 350,000 homes in Oahu. You think 800 more homes that are subsidized by taxpayers is going to make housing more affordable for everybody else? Honolulu also has a policy called inclusionary zoning. That's where if you're a builder and you build a big housing development, you have to sell or lease or rent some of the developments below your cost to people who need affordable housing. So what do? Well, first of all, you don't build as much because you can't afford to do it. And second of all, you charge more for the non-affordable units to make up for the losses you're incurring on the affordable units. So let's say you own a house and you are building an affordable, a big development, and you put some affordable housing in it, so you charge more for the market rate units. Then you say, hey, I just noticed the price of housing went up because market rate units are selling for more, so I can sell my house for more. So everybody who's a homeowner gets a windfall, and everybody who's a home buyer ends up paying higher prices, not just the people who are buying in the units that are cross-subsidizing the affordable ones, but everybody ends up paying more who's buying a new house. So inclusionary zoning does exactly the opposite of what it's supposed to do. It makes housing less affordable. It provides affordable housing for a handful of people. And someday I would like to find out who are those people who are buying that affordable housing, because I suspect a lot of them are college students who expect to be earning millions of dollars in their career, but right now haven't earned anything because they just got out of college, and so they say, oh, I've got no income, so I get to have some of this affordable housing. So not the people who are seeing camped in the homeless camps. Now, the good news is you can fix this problem. You can repeal the land use laws. Now, Florida passed a growth management law in 1985 that required that every county and city in the state write a growth management plan. In 2011, they repealed that law. Now, they didn't repeal the authority. The counties could still do growth management, but they didn't have to. And so some counties stopped doing it, and some counties kept doing it. Around Tampa, you're starting to see huge developments go in that couldn't have gone in before because they've given up on growth management. And if you look at median value to income ratios for housing, you see it went way up in the 2000s. Before the financial crisis, then it went way down, and in some places like Miami it's gone back up again because they've continued to do growth management. But in other places like Tampa and Gainesville and Tallahassee, it hasn't gone up again because they've stopped doing growth management. So that would be one solution. I would recommend that you just say that counties aren't allowed to zone, cities can zone, and Honolulu City is defined as some subset of Honolulu County, and you can only zone in the city, and the county can't zone unless it's been annexed. Now, some of you might, are we getting close to the end?
Yes.
All right, well, let me rush through. I was going to talk about how the Supreme Court has unfortunately legalized the taking of your property through this kind of regulation, and I think we can reverse that. But I wrote a paper on that the Grassroot Institute published several years ago, so I'll just rely on your ability to go read that. But one thing that concerns me, and the data are a little uncertain, because every year the Census Bureau does a survey of about 3.5 million people. And when you're talking about the population of a state or a large urban area, they get pretty accurate numbers. But when you're talking about small numbers like the number of native Hawaiians who are still living on Oahu, the margin of error is pretty high. But the numbers seem to show that the number of native Hawaiians living on Oahu has declined. And that's because housing is so unaffordable here. They moved to some of the other islands where housing is more affordable. So one way or another, I think the Supreme Court will be willing to overturn these laws. If you can't get them overturned in the legislature, it would take somebody actually taking them to court and seeing if they can go after the state for doing it. I just want to close with one thought by a well-known land use expert. And that thought is that if you're not serious about repealing those land use laws, then you're not serious about making housing more affordable. And that person, fortunately, is here today if you have any questions for them. A couple more plugs for my books. Kali'i mentioned them to you. I brought them here, and I want to give you two incentives to buy them today. One is that you can we're selling them for $20. The list price is $25. I suspect you could get them for a little less on Amazon, but you won't get my signature. So that's incentive number one. And incentive number two is you'll relieve me of having to carry them back to my Airbnb on the back of my bicycle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Please stay up here with me, right over here.
Okay.
That was wonderful, wasn't it? If you'd like a copy of the report that Randal published for the Grassroot Institute, it's on your table, a hard copy, build up or build out, or you can go to our website and get a copy that you can share with anybody. And we'd like to ask you also, as you prepare for questions and answers, if you care to get more information and stay in touch with us, please fill out your comment cards, and would love to have a comment about Randal's presentation today. Now we have a time for questions and answers, and because we are broadcasting, we're going to need you to come to the microphone, which is over here, and we'll open it up in a moment. So kindly come and stand in line if you would, if you'd like to talk with Randal. And I'd like to open up first with some conversation between Randal and myself. Randal, when I was an economics major at Northwestern University, we learned that economics was defined by scarcity. In fact, the textbook I remember clearly from Paul Samuelson said, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources to competing ends. So my whole frame of reference in studying economics was to look at scarcity and see how different parties compete. And it was all about driving that price higher and higher. Now, what I think you're talking about is a complete paradigm shift in economics. Instead of an economics that looks at things being scarce, you're trying to reveal to us that land is actually not scarce. Land available for housing is actually considered scarce only as an artificial contrivance. Any thoughts about that paradigm shift and how that changes the way that we find solutions?
Well, I think there's one branch of economics that talks about scarcity in markets, and there's another branch of economics that talks about how government works. And markets aren't perfect, but governments are even less perfect. I like to say that urban planners are good at doing two things. They're good at creating surpluses of things we don't want, and they're good at creating scarcities of things we do want. So land is an abundant resource. It's not infinite, but it's extremely abundant in the United States. We have one of the lowest population densities in the world, and there's plenty of land. And so what did urban planners do? In order to save something that's very abundant, in order to save rural open space or farms or whatever, they created a scarcity of something that wasn't abundant, which was land for housing.
Well, thank you. And with that, at the Grassroot Institute, we want to proclaim that we can be thinking in abundance, in terms of abundance of resources and unlocking abundances for prosperity of all people. Now I see people at the line over here. Would love to hear what you have to say. Could you come to the microphone and please give your name and state your question for Randal? And Randal, you and I are sharing this one microphone here.
Okay.
Hello, Kennedy and Randal. Thank you for coming. I'm Sam King. I'm the president of the Federalist Society, actually, and we recently, in Hawaii, and we recently just had a talk about affordable housing, so this is a very interesting topic to me. One of the things we talked about was the fact, and there's so many questions I have, but this is one in particular that I think would be great in your presentation. Urban planners like inclusionary zoning because they think it solves something other than price, which is social exclusion. So the whole point of inclusionary zoning is the theory that high concentrations of urban poverty are bad, and they usually result in racial discrimination and racial exclusion and racial segregation. So the whole point of inclusionary zoning is to get lots of rich people and poor people to mix together by saying, here's this house, and we're going to force you to have this low-income part of the house. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, whether or not it's necessary, whether or not you actually see that in Hawaii, that kind of segregation, and if there's another way to address it.
Well, urban planners live in a fantasy land where they imagine that people will behave the way they think they ought to behave, not the way the urban planners themselves behave. Because you talk to the urban planners and say, where do you live? Well, they live in single-family homes. They don't live in these high-density buildings. And so you have to sit down and say, is it working? And the answer is no. Inclusionary zoning isn't working. It's driving people out. It's driving low-income people out. As I said, we don't, oops, I didn't mean to do that. We don't really know what's happening in Hawaii, but we have really good data showing that the number of blacks in San Francisco is rapidly declining. The number of blacks in Los Angeles is declining because of unaffordable housing. And the fact that you've got some inclusionary zoning, who's living in that is probably not blacks. Like I say, it's probably college students or recent college graduates.
Thank you very much, Sam. Phil, please come to the microphone and state your question.
Thank you. I took particular note of your statement about Hawaii Kai and how Kaiser was sort of hoodwinked out of what he thought he was going to be able to do. The whole notion, could you just make a little comment on leasehold? Because what I saw in that formula was individuals feeling that they earned the right to make profit out of housing. That, over a long period of time, becomes a mechanism that continues to increase the housing price. How do you avoid that?
Randal?
Well, the developers have learned their lesson from that, and what they do is they create a covenants for an area. And the covenants say these areas are going to be developed, these areas are going to be left as parks, development's going to be at a certain density, and so on and so forth. And then they create homeowners associations which are allowed to modify the covenants after they take over. But until the development is completed, the covenants are protected only by the developer, and the homeowner association has no authority over it until the development is done. So that when the development is done, then they'll transfer the authority to the homeowner association, and only then would the residents be able to have any influence on what's going on. So that way they protect themselves from residents suddenly rising up when the development is half done and preventing the other half from being completed. I've seen that happen in a lot of places, and I think if Henry J. had done something like that when he started doing Hawaii Kai, he would have prevented that problem.
Thank you, Randal. Kathleen, do you have your question?
It's Catherine.
Catherine, forgive me, Catherine Hensley.
Mr. O'Toole, thank you. I'm a member of the Waikiki Neighborhood Board.
Okay.
And the people that come before us, many of them developers, want to go up and up and up and up. And they have purchased land that originally is zoned for 25 feet of development, and they go up 350 feet or 400. So I love what you've done and what you've said. I've also lived in many of the places, for instance, Texas. You're right, there's no zoning. There can be a cattle ranch next to a house. And that really is wonderful. But tell me, where on this island, and how do we break it free, is the land? I mean, I've seen it, there's land all over this place. It could be developed, but how do we break it free? How do we make it?
Of course, Waikiki is already very expensive land, and a rule of thumb is that the development you build has to be a certain multiple of the cost of the land. So if you've got really expensive land, you have to put a really big, dense development on it to recover that cost. But if we opened up more land to development, then land prices throughout Oahu would decline, including on Waikiki, and you'd have less pressure to build those 300 tall-foot buildings. We know the land is there. You know the land is there. There's two ways to free it up. One is to repeal the 1961 land use law, and the other is for somebody who owns some of that land to go to the Supreme Court of the United States and say, hey, this law is violating my property rights and it's harming minorities by forcing them to move off the island because they can't afford to live here. So either by the property rights clause of the Constitution or by the Fair Housing Act, which says passing a land use law that makes housing more expensive and turns minorities away is just like putting up a sign saying no blacks allowed or no Native Hawaiians allowed. I don't know which of those two arguments the current Supreme Court would buy. In 2015, by a 5-4 decision, they bought the fair housing argument. The current Supreme Court might not buy that anymore, but then they would be more likely to buy the property rights arguments. I think you could win either way, making those arguments in the Supreme Court.
So are you saying that as an individual, I could go to the Supreme Court and file a suit against the 1961 law?
If you're a landowner, yeah.
Only if I'm a landowner?
Yeah, you just find a landowner who's being hurt by this. Yeah, make them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you're interested, we also have a study on what Randal was talking about, and that is the discriminatory effects of the housing policies. And you can just contact Joe Kent. Wave over there, Joe. He'll let you know where that is on our website. Ted Peck, please ask your question.
Yeah, still kind of piece together. I should have it pieced together by the time I'm done talking.
Quickly.
I work in the green space, and so I know a lot of the environmental people, and they have pushed against whole peeling and some of the others because they want to preserve ag land because we want to be self-sustaining. And so I just and you know, sitting here, you know, Catherine's an elected official, you know, and the Colonel here is an elected official, but I don't know if there's a lot of other policymakers here, and I'm curious, how do you get in front of both state and city and county policymakers, and even in the agricultural, in the educational and in the environmental sector, what kind of receptivity have you had in your attempts to persuade them to take a different approach?
Well, I would have no credibility getting in front of your elected officials because I'm not a voter here. They might listen to me, but if they're not interested in my arguments, they're not going to pay a lot of attention. I'm really trying to give you the arguments because you're going to have more credibility to do that. And I think the argument that's going to divide the environmental community or the left community is the argument about the impact on minorities. Because they claim that they care about the environment, but they also claim they care about minorities and poor people. And if you're saying, okay, you're doing marginal good for the environment. I mean, agricultural land is probably has the most environmental impacts of any kind of land. It's got far more environmental impacts than suburbs. So you're preserving agricultural land for growing crops is very marginal environmental benefits. But you're imposing these humongous costs on low-income people, among whom are a number of minorities. And so making that argument, I think, will help convince people that maybe we need to rethink this policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Ted, in response to your question, I think the good people here who are members of Grassroot Institute are seeing a lot more effectiveness in getting in front of our public officials, particularly counties, county councils, and our state legislature. Speaking of which, I'd like to invite Representative Rita Cavanella to come and ask her question.
Well, I sort of echo the same questions that the previous speaker said, but first, let me just say that I was the chairwoman in the Committee of Housing at the House of Representatives for 6 years, and I came here today because I want to hear what you have to say, because we did have a lot of problems when we were trying to increase housing affordability. And one of which that they came up with was change that's how they go affordable housing to workforce housing. Now I can understand why I'm the only legislator in this group. A lot of the things that you said are contrary to the popular belief on the square building. One of which is you said that, and I'm not arguing your point, and maybe at a later time you can sit down and explain this to me. You said that the more condensed housing is, the more expensive it is, which is what we try to do because of the expensive land. And even when we repeal the land use law that you refer to, one of the problems that we have is private ownership. There's hardly any state land to build those. Not unless we go to parks and whatnot. So my question is this: how can we persuade those private landowners to donate to state land? Because that's, the developers say that's the only way they can build affordable housing if the land is free.
Before Randall tackles that question, we'll have one more question after Representative Rita, and that'll be closing off our questions completely for this hour. Randall.
All right, well, the state shouldn't be the one to build the housing. The states are really good at cost overruns. They're not very good at producing something efficiently. So the important thing is to keep that land private and not have the state take it over. Now in the 1950s, the landowners didn't want that land to be used for housing because they were making money off of pineapple and sugar cane and things like that. Now they're not. They're not making money off of those agricultural crops. So if you released the land use restrictions and let them develop their land, they would be happy to do it. Maybe not every single one of them, but you wouldn't have to get every single one of them to do it to make housing a lot more affordable.
Thank you. And if I could add to that, the Grassroot Institute has had conversations with about half a dozen developers on each of the islands throughout the state. And they're all in agreement that the private sector will and can do more if government will get out of the way and reduce the amount of regulation, particularly through the Land Use Commission, because that's extremely costly and drives up the cost of construction. The private market will provide the solutions if government gets out of the way. And we have our final question now. Could you come to the microphone, please?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm just curious, as far as the rail goes, do you have any research numbers, maybe in billions, how much it will cost to repurpose all of those concrete pillars into an elevated bus lane? Because I love the bus.
No, I haven't studied in detail. Basically, I haven't even looked at the surface of what it looks like, but I suspect that you're going to have to remove whatever they put in for tracks, if they put anything in at all yet, and then you'll have to have on-ramps and off-ramps. So it will cost a little bit. And really, it's almost tongue-in-cheek when I say that. Here's what I think is really the most likely scenario, is that you finish the first 16 miles of that rail line, you don't build any more ever again, you learn your lesson, you run that rail line for 30 years until it's worn out, because this is what they don't tell you. Every 30 years you have to completely rebuild it because it completely wears out. That's going to cost several billion more. So you run it till it's worn out, and then you decide 30 years from now, do you want to repurpose it into exclusive bus lanes? Do you want to turn it into an elevated highway, or do you want to just tear it down? That's a question for 30 years from now. You're going to be stuck with trains for 30 years from now, but you only have to be stuck with 16 miles of trains that cost you $6 billion and not 20 miles of trains that cost you $10 billion if you're smart. Thank you.
Thank you. Give a big hand to Randal O'Toole, a good friend. Thank you very much, Randal.
Thank you.
Well, let me ask you a question. Did you learn something today? Yes. Did you learn of a way of looking at things that's different from the groupthink that's all around us in the state? I think so. And that's what it's all about. We want to promote a way of thinking that is radical, that shifts paradigms, one that moves us from saying we have to live with total scarcity into one in which we produce from our abundance. So I thank you. Two things before you go. Number one, be sure to come up and see Randal and pick up some of his books, because you'd hate to see him have to carry those on his bicycle back to the airport. And then if you're new to us, we'd love you to fill out a card over here, and we'll stay in touch with you with our weekly reports and videos and other material. But until then, I'm Keli'i Akina. Thank you for being at the Grassroot Institute, and aloha.